Jasmine is one of our sisters from Melbourne, and we're very happy to have you here. Jasmine's a mother of 3 children. She's a wife, a feminist, and a counsellor with the Australian Breastfeeding Association for nearly 15 years. After dedicating years of her life to supporting mums on the National Breastfeeding Helpline, struggling with a society that devalues mothers, she never imagined she'd be accused of hate speech by a fellow breastfeeding counsellor for saying only mothers breastfeed. Jasmine's topic: when volunteer breastfeeding counsellors are sacked for insisting only mothers breastfeed. Thanks, Jasmine.
Okay, so on my mother's side, we've got 3 generations of breastfeeding mothers. So my grandma, who had three girls, and like most women then in the 40s and 50s and women today, often it doesn't work for the first baby, because the things that women are told in hospital and after they give birth, you know, actively sabotages their breastfeeding relationships. And my grandmother was actually a nurse, so she sort of knew it wasn't quite right what she was being told. But, you know, when I was pregnant, she told me about how you used to have to hold them while they cried for the last kind of hour, because we're only allowed to feed them every 4 hours, you know, back in the day. So that was my mother. We've got a photo of her, you'll see in a minute. And then my mother married a lovely man, my father, and his mother was a doctor. And my big sister was a surprise. So shortly after my big sister was born, my mother recommended that my grandmother recommended that my mother go on the pill, which, you know, the pill in the early 70s wasn't a very subtle form of reproductive control. So rapidly, you know, her milk dried up, and my sister was weaned by, you know, 6 to 8 weeks, and my mum went back to work so my dad could finish his PhD. But then I came along, you know, in 1975. My mother had worked in women's health in the intervening period, and you know, got some further qualifications as a librarian. So I actually breastfed until I was 3 and weaned myself. So, you know, it was kind of on me then to let my children determine their own breastfeeding journeys after my mother had gone through all of that. So yes, this is me with my first, about 3 hours before she was born. She's now 17. And my mother, who's having a bit of a chat to Ella about getting wriggle on. So Mum was a member of Nursing Mothers Association of Australia in 1975, and then when I was pregnant with my eldest, she signed me up. It was compulsory pretty much. So 2004, and I'm actually still a member. I'm not quite sure why, but I guess that, you know, I'm hoping they might make amends one day. I think they will eventually, but yes. So I trained as a breastfeeding counsellor almost straight away. You used to have to be a member for 6 months before you could start training, and you had to get referred by another counsellor who'd kind of, you know, agree that you were made of the right stuff to be able to train. So yeah, I did get training pretty much as soon as I could, and then when she was not quite 2, just shy of 2, I got my certificate to counsel, as they call it, in 2006. And really, you know, birth and breastfeeding was a really, I hate the word empowering, but, you know, it made me like the woman I am. It was a really positive experience, and in my own mum's group, and, you know, with people I came into contact with through ABA, I could see that that wasn't the case for most women. And so I really wanted to be able to help them to like achieve their own, you know, breastfeeding experience with their babies. Because I knew, you know, from my grandmother and my mother and from them how much they blame themselves, you know, when it doesn't work out. And I knew that it wasn't their fault, like that it was society's fault and the way that we treat women and mothers. So yeah, obviously it's super personal, because to see this beautiful, like, mother-friendly organisation then like turn against women and, you know, make them be parents or families who breastfeed, and, you know, censor and shame women who want to honour mothers, is just like my worst nightmare, pretty much. Anyway, so the first sign that something was going wrong was at a breastfeeding conference in March 2020, where a young breastfeeding counsellor and I were having drinks, you know, on conference eve, chatting about things that were happening in our lives. And I shared the experience of a young man who, in my sort of extended family, on the other side of the family, who'd started to identify as a male, as a female. He was a male, or is a male. And I talked about this young person who had, you know, very poor mental health from his early teenage years, and how his family, you know, my extended family, had refused to authorise him making any kind of medical transition because they didn't think it was going to help. It wasn't a core issue. And I'd just come from a family funeral where this young person hadn't gone to the funeral because they felt it was too much to go in their new, you know, identity. And I was really just sharing in what I thought was a sensible, safe, female-centric space, you know, this experience, and how I did think that it was the right thing that they hadn't allowed any kind of medical transition when he was a child. He had to make that decision as an adult. This young breastfeeding counsellor piped up that she was at the gender clinic that day before the conference with her 4-year-old and looking at socially transitioning her 4-year-old. And like, I could barely speak, you know, still how when I describe it now, like, I remember my heart just kind of stopping and, you know, realising that I'd obviously upset her with the story that I told, but also just incredibly shocked that this, you know, little girl who was barely weaned, you know, like in the Breastfeeding Association, most babies, like 2-3, you know, years is pretty normal for counsellors. Babies, so barely weaned, but then, you know, taking on this kind of gendered identity, and it just made no sense to me. And you know, the conversation didn't go very well, and other counsellors chimed in and said, you know, if you don't let them transition, then they'll commit suicide, and I just said, well, that's not true, you know, like, where's the evidence that that's true? Anyway, so this turned into my first. As a counsellor, you sign up to a code of ethics, which is supposed to be about creating, you know, a safe space. I hate that word. I'm so triggered by inclusive, safe space. You know, like, all of these terms just kind of make me feel ill now because I know how they're used to, like, control women. So anyway, the code of ethics is designed to protect everybody within the association, so we don't get into situations where we're endorsing particular products or hospitals or, you know, obstetricians or midwives, or, you know, that everyone can have a different experience and, you know, feel supported in a kind of neutral environment, you know, where it's about helping the particular mother in front of you. Anyway, so that turned into my first breach of code of conduct, which I didn't really fully engage with at the time, but I realised later that the 3 people in the association who looked at that complaint from this mother and her complaint was that she felt, vilified and discriminated against with my views. Her and her child, and the community that they identify with. So, so I realised that 3 people in the association, this is just an indication of how captured it is in Melbourne, with kind of left-leaning, progressive identifying women. So the councillor, the branch rep, we separate into regions, so there's and the regional rep all had children who were trans-identifying, Yeah. And how they're supposed to, or housemates for the regional rep, So non-binary, trans-identifying and trans-identifying were the 3 mothers / parents, in the room. So how they're supposed to independently assess, my different opinion, it is pretty hard to know. So can I do this myself now? Or sorry, I'm going to get you to nip over. So then the next big negative sign at the other end of the year was that we started the dreaded inclusive language consultation, and we all know now this is how you take over an organisation and move it to align with gender ideology. You change the language, and you change the reality. And, it's all there in black and white in every founding document of the Australian Breastfeeding Association that we're there for women, and mothers. You can count the number of times it says those words, but just through sleight of hand by, suggesting that perhaps more gender inclusive language around parents and families, would be better and would make more people access ABA's services. This is the allegation. And also categorising people who don't want to use that language as mean and nasty and exclusionary, So that was how it was done. And I've popped up the post that kicked it all off on, November 9, 2020, which was just the strangest, it went on and on, but just the strangest distortion of a genuine consultation process. It asserted we've always been inclusive, we are inclusive, the inclusiveness was always supposed to be about including breastfeeding mothers in society, but we just picked that word and then, suggesting that unrelated guidelines that the World Health Organization put out, which were actually about staff speaking multiple different languages, and how you use, gender inclusive language only when it's relevant. So if you're talking to, a pack of French speaking or, some other language speaking, that you don't make gender relevant unless it is relevant. It was just completely unrelated, but it was like, we're inclusive, we've always been inclusive. Oh look, World Health Organization tells us we should be inclusive. Some people in the ABA feel excluded with what we're currently doing. So, let's go. And so what happened almost straight away, if we'll go to the next slide, is that myself and others chimed in and said, hang on, this doesn't seem quite right. Language like pregnant people, menstruators, cervix havers, birthing bodies and body feeding is not in fact inclusive. This was my point. So, it's anti-women political censorship. I did have a nice way with words back then before I was, traumatised by all of this, which seeks to control and deprioritise and devalue women and mothers. And to have this called inclusive is just extremely offensive and wrong, a massive distortion of what it actually does. And I did throw this threat out, not thinking that in fact they choose to sack me instead of me choose to resign at the time. that if they ever deprioritised mothers and women, then I would be forced to resign. So, that really kind of kicked it off, and I obviously hit a big nerve and had a big response from counsellors. And then, this was deleted almost immediately. Everything I ever said was deleted. So, it was ironic in the extreme that, nearly a year later, these things were given as the reason as to why it was unsafe for me to, continue as a counsellor within the ABA. Someone might remember what I said in a post that was there for 25 minutes, Anyway, so, we see from another branch president, how they responded. So again, that it's offensive to describe inclusive language as in unpositive terms, that we need to be respectful, and that, we're excluding people if we don't. So manipulative, Anyway, and again, the leadership of all of these people who posted these sorts of things, some of them have said out loud that they've got children or young adult children who, identify either as trans or in the rainbow community. We never know quite what that means. So, yeah, it certainly wasn't an impartial process, which is what our Code of Ethics and Constitution calls for, Anyway, so, yeah, it was just classic. I've learned this term now, DARVO, the deny, attack, reverse victim order. It was just classic DARVO tactics. And that's why everything had to be deleted, because if you said plainly what it meant to you, then it kind of undid the success of their approach. Yes, thank you. So, quite quickly it became a one-way process where you couldn't have a conversation on closed social media groups. You had to just email the executive director with your concerns. And then, we had like 5 to 7 over following months, gaslighting, kind of issuing of new changes to language guidelines. So it'd be like, so we're not changing. Yeah, we said we weren't changing. We were just checking in, but then every time those, trans aligned or, progressive identifying counsellors would just ignore the new guidelines. So, that a statement would come out which reminding us that we're mum to mum, but on, the Facebook groups with like 7,000, open Facebook groups with 7,000, majority women counsellors would say, we're counsellors, parents, just like you. And it's like, well, no, you're actually not able to train to be a counsellor unless you're a mother, as it says, in all of our documents. But somehow, that would just be passed over. And myself and a couple of other, foolhardy, brave, stupid counsellors would, continue to subtly raise this every time not every time, but many times that they'd just undermine our mother-focused language. We'd say things like this, ABA is here for mothers and their families. We provide a mother-to-mother support service. Only mothers breastfeed, which is why they need maternity leave to birth and then breastfeed the baby. And this post I just include because, I got so many complaints in the end, I kind of lose track of them all. But, so the first lot I had 6, and then, when they finally decided they had to get rid of me, I had another 7, which they trawled through my anonymous Twitter and non-identifying Facebook. So it says in all our documents, unless you identify yourself as a breastfeeding counsellor, your Facebook is yours, but they couldn't get me where I was identifying as a breastfeeder, describing myself as a breastfeeding counsellor, saying the wrong type of things. So they just went to my Facebook and grabbed it from there, or on other people's private Facebook accounts. If I'd interacted with people and expressed an opinion there, then they just took that and said, yeah, you're obviously not going to stop talking about it, so you have to go. anyway, I still can't quite believe it when I say out loud what happened. But yes, this was one of the breaches of code of ethics which they upheld. So they didn't uphold, or they didn't mention that it was raised as hate speech and bullying, but they did say that it brought the ABA into disrepute, that I'd said this. So they never really explained why it was. And also why it was that from, November to July, which was when I finally got sacked, this was raised, investigated. Like, I had my investigation interview with a couple of board members, that they said quite sympathetic things in that investigation interview, or at least one of them did. But yeah, that later it would twist and turn and say, okay, always about this bringing us into disrepute, airing our dirty linen publicly by saying, I'm a mother, we support mothers. Yeah, so they really did not accept the outcome of the consultation. Those who wanted to describe us as breastfeeding parents, they just refused to accept that the majority of counsellors and Australian mothers didn't want to talk about ourselves in that way. And still to this day, Ange got, like a colleague of mine, you're speaking later, so it's okay for me to identify you, got a notice from her local breastfeeding group just today. And again, it's talking about parents, we're parents just like you. So, don't trust them when they say they've changed, they've learned a lesson. They really haven't. So I've just got some more examples of the way that they distort their mission and purpose and ultimately service in being for breastfeeding mothers. It's supporting families to get to their breastfeeding goals, which has a really unusual, feeling to it, And, our nationally funded helpline is actually 1-800 mum to mum, so you can but when the breastfeeding helpline manager reports on calls to the helpline, it's all turned into this families and callers and parents language, You have to drill down to, table 6 to see that, the word mum somewhere, and to identify that actually 95 upwards % of callers to the helpline are women. And when men call, it's generally because their wife partner is crying and they need to start the conversation, and then hand the phone over. So it's just so cruel. I think that's the other thing. And as a woman and mother who's advocated for these women, to see them hopping on, especially in the middle of COVID, and they say, "Hi mums, hi mamas, I'm a first-time mum," and they tell their story. And these, nasty counsellors, the same ones who I knew had put in these formal complaints about me, would say, some parents find, or, that's it. We're trained in our counselling to say, some mothers find. So, we're not supposed to kind of direct them, but they turn that into some parents find, or, you're a great parent, or, post these ridiculous memes about, are you a parent of one, a parent of two, or parenting's hard, how do you, just such gaslighting and so insensitive to the experience of these women in front of them. Yeah, but it gets worse. So November, we've been told, no, we're sticking with mum to mum language, but through December, through January, they just continue with their parents speak. And this was, a particular example. So one of the things I loved most about being a breastfeeding counsellor was running breastfeeding education classes, which are a great opportunity. Most of the damage is done to women's, like chances of breastfeeding as they'd planned, when they're pregnant and in the early weeks of breastfeeding or in hospital, So getting to them before those kind of corrosive ideas set in is really important. So breastfeeding education classes are a great way to do that. And, we know that when you help women with the, technicalities or what can go wrong when they're pregnant, it really inoculates them from a lot of difficulties that they might have. But here we've got pregnant parents again, join up for a breastfeeding education class. This contributes to confidence for pregnant parents. And I managed to get the executive officer of ABA to change this, pointing it out to her that it was inconsistent with our mission and with the language guidelines that she's instituted. And just the pathetic response that I got from her, it's like, oh, well, we're short on space and, it is for partners too, and like men do attend as well. So we've changed it to expectant parents, like as if that doesn't also deny mothers, Anyway, so it does currently say expectant parents, but yeah. Anyway, so this was the other post that was upheld. So, I had initially 6 complaints that came through in like late Jan, early Feb, allegations of, bullying, harassment, and, the hate speech one. And then this was, like unprofessional conduct or bringing the ABA into disrepute, And all these counsellors, they still work there. There've been no consequences for them for changing our language and disrespecting mothers and women. So it's pretty obvious really what the prevailing view was in the head office. Yeah. So we'll just go to the next one, thank you. Yeah, this was the initiating post. So, this post was all about we're parents just like you, we're a safe and inclusive space. It was all the kind of buzzwords, And this counsellor, she's still got to this day, like I said before, we're not supposed to identify our political allegiances or sell a particular product when we're breastfeeding counsellors, because we don't want to alienate people from our role as breastfeeding counsellors. So, but this particular counsellor, her Facebook profile, she's a moderator and admin. So this is all publicly available. I'm not defaming anyone. It's just the truth of what it says on her. On her page, she's got a photo of her breastfeeding one of her children, and her child or her baby is holding the trans flag, the ones. Oh. Yeah. So, the very people that you see, in the Age interviewed in response to these new, academic outputs from the women's health leaders, which I absolutely welcome, but the very people that they interviewed from the ABA about that, acknowledging that, there are risks to de-sex language and that, that ABA continues to use mother-to-mother language. They know that these moderators and admins on these big national Facebook pages are advocating for trans ideology in their position as moderators and admins, and they do nothing about it other than put out these, generic guidelines that say, don't do it. Think about, would you wear, like the example they gave just a few months ago was, would you wear a t-shirt saying what you say on your Facebook page to an ABA meeting? If you wouldn't, don't put it on your Facebook page, So anyway, it's all quite ridiculous really. But yeah, it wasn't just me, it's actually 7 counsellors with, 110 years of counselling experience who have similar accusations. Things they raised during the consultation process were brought back to haunt them and they were all accused of harassment and intimidation, and we were all muted and or kicked off these internal and external pages where we said outrageous things like only mothers breastfeed. Yeah, and 4 of these counsellors have now been sacked, and another one who was employed by the Australian Breastfeeding Association, took leave and continues to be in dispute with the ABA. So really 5 of the 7 of us, it's been a terminal relationship as a result of this ideological takeover. And they're still, to this day, refusing to specify which sex, in plain terms, which sex they are there to support, So we've just had the AGM in November, and they've just printed the minutes to that AGM with all these questions in there like 2 weeks ago. And, they still, when you ask questions about sex, they respond with gendered terms, or they talk about all parents or families, or, So they're still not being honest, which is the thing that makes me so angry. I've had this in person in my investigation interviews, and then in follow-up, training videos, correspondence, AGM minutes, where the current and ongoing president of the ABA, talks about how it needs to be a safe space in the ABA. And what that means is that if a counsellor or, a mother says parent, then we need to mirror that back, So what they say publicly and what they say within the ABA, is really different. Yeah. And they hold one side in this ideological debate to a very strict disciplinary standard, and the other side, they let them do whatever they want. Yeah. Yeah. So this thing, you can see you're doing the best you can in this parenting game. It feels so petty when I show you this post and was like, my response to this is why I got sacked, It's just like hard to believe, really, isn't it? But yeah, we've definitely been told time and time again that saying mum makes some people unsafe, and that it's like disrespectful. So, yay. So it was really at that stage that I knew that I needed to let other people know, what was happening, and I guess hold the ABA to account for its duplicity internally and externally. So I've been sharing some of the lead up, with Bernard at the Australian, who's just the most wonderful kind of gentleman you'll ever come across, as I know a lot of you know. And it was really his coverage of the whole issue that made me realise that Australians do care about women and mothers, and even breastfeeding mothers, even though they might think some of us are a little bit kooky, when we breastfeed our kids until they're 3, but and they're really not comfortable, like most normal people, with our language being taken away from us like this, and our services as well. That's the thing. It's like people think it's just about language, but it's not. Once you've got the language, then you've changed the fundamental nature of the service and who it's for. And and these are all volunteers. We all signed up to help women and mothers, and then to be told we have to help everyone. Where was the consultation? Where was the risk assessment? But yeah, I do think, one really positive thing that's come out of this is, despite a lot of, obviously the Australians behind a paywall, there is a really high level of awareness in the Australian community about what's going on, with the ABA, and although people don't quite believe it until you kind of tell them the details. And, I've had a million conversations with ex-counsellors, well, they're like, well, no, but really, but who's this for, and they don't quite believe it. But yeah, I think we've just got to keep telling the truth about what happened. But yeah, ABA, continues to deny it. So they're like, no, there's no pressure. No, the conflict wasn't around language. It wasn't around use of the word mum. Like, they continue to say that, and even in, I could show you a million letters that I've had, they just never honestly respond to what actually happened to all of us. Yes, so we had, the Australian Times too, and then we went a bit into kind of mum land with Kids Spot, and this was really heartening to me. And you can still go in and participate on this survey today. So, when you ask normal Australian mums and dads and, people with young children, should we be using more inclusive language when it comes to breastfeeding? And just almost everyone says no. Why would you do that? It's fine the way it is. 97% for those who can't necessarily see that. And, and it's probably even higher than that, really, when you've got people who don't want to get involved. So they're like, oh, I'm on the fence on this, not sure. And, only 1% who think we should actually change it. Now, I just wonder what people like the CPSU think. They probably haven't looked at this, but when they introduced protections for chest feeding into, the award for the Victorian Public Service, chest feeding, of course, is something that women do who don't identify as women. So, it's ridiculous, really. Those women were already protected because they're protected as breastfeeding women. We just have to kind of pretend that there's something else. Anyway, but yeah, it's certainly not a majority view that the CPSU are pushing there. So, and then I really realised after this Kids Spot article and the ABA's response to that, which was to sack another counsellor who had been inadvertently identified through that journalist media coverage, or ABA guessed who it was, that I realised actually the end game of all of this is about men being able to breastfeed, and that it's always the wedge of women who identify as men come first, and people kind of want to be kind and feel a bit sorry for them, and it's a bit hard to understand, so they let them in, and then what way do you have to say no to actual men if you've let identifying men through the door? So, and what actually happened to trigger this bit of media work off was that the ABA put out a series of training videos just to counsellors. Again, they never say it publicly, they always say it privately, but in which you had the Victorian branch president saying that mostly trans women generally don't give birth. And it's just the horror of the ideological capture of this woman. And casually using terms like top surgery and suggesting that that some trans men may be able to breastfeed if they've retained breast tissue, just like women who have breast reduction surgery may be able to breastfeed if they've got some breast tissue left. But it's I had a couple of mothers with trans identifying girls who'd had vasectomies approach me through social media after ABA had said this, and they were just horrified. This woman's actually a trained midwife, but she sort of moved into more, the Victorian branch president has moved more into kind of social work, youth work, kind of advocacy, which is obviously, it seems like where she's got all of this from. But, the whole point of double mastectomy for trans men is to remove all the breast tissue, they're doing well if they manage to reattach the nipples afterwards. So the idea that they may be able to breastfeed, it's just a lie, It's just normalizing like radical surgery that's going to deny those like incredibly vulnerable women, their later breastfeeding opportunities. So I just couldn't, I couldn't stomach it when I realised how captured the ABA was in putting together this, what they said was a specialist resource just for the LGBTIA plus community, but actually it was driving out through the rest of services in the ABA. So, and that included men, and that this training video, specifically, like still use weasel words, but specifically pointed out trans women and their desire to breastfeed and them having a right to access counsellor support, on the National Breastfeeding Helpline, and that we shouldn't assume anything about the body parts of someone calling helpline or ask invasive, inappropriate questions of them. Like, this is the language that was in the training video, And like, they actually tried to sack me before they put that training video out, but other counsellors recorded it for me. So that's how I even know, a lot of this. Yeah. So yeah, and the ABA just continues to duck and weave. I guess that's like the main thing I just need to say out loud, that they're still not being honest about all of this. Yeah, so, but July 28th, was when I finally got sacked, and I did kind of fall in a bit of a heap for a couple of months after that. But some of the media work that I'd already established, like with the fabulous Anastats and some others, it was already underway, so it just kind of continued on. Even though I had to kind of step away a little bit because it was kind of taking over my life in a not very positive way. But yeah, just to kind of finish up on, what my crimes were. So you've seen the two with, Sarah B, as she describes herself on social media. She's got another name in real life. Where I was saying we're a service for mothers, and the other person where I said the hate speech and bullying of that only mothers breastfeed, and then we had all these other examples that they trawled through my Twitter, which is completely anonymised, and my Facebook, as other examples of why I was unsafe to remain as a counsellor. So my fury in response to ABA releasing this like horrific photo, and I shared that when they released it to promote their new booklet, and just said, like, how can you partner with this? Like, somebody stole this baby's milk and mother, And I do believe, and I know this is a bit controversial sometimes in feminist circles, but I do believe that babies have a right to their mother's milk, and I think women as well have a right to be supported in like the health benefits to them, which are significant if they breastfeed that child. So yeah. Anyway, I know that's a little bit controversial. So we had that, and then the other horror, which is what triggered me to do the Daily Mail article, was that there's a trans woman on ABA's national Facebook page, which I'm still banned from, who was boasting on the Mother's Day post, which was this, I met you and a mother was born, sort of mum schmaltzy stuff that they fought back with after the Australian article. So yeah, we had this trans woman saying how amazing it was that they'd been able to give colostrum to their baby, and like horrific backstory about his partner, female partner, had a health condition, which was why she couldn't breastfeed. And not just me, but other breastfeeding counsellors, provided information about that, actually only the birth mother makes colostrum, and that some of the health complications that like his partner had would have been because she didn't breastfeed, like hemorrhage and the placenta coming away and all of that sort of thing. And so I raised it with ABA, back in May, stupidly thinking that they hadn't included men as well, in that it was about dysphoric women. But actually, no, this was one of the other things that I got sacked for. So I said, counsellors need a safe workplace. Are you aware that Jennifer Buckley, appears to be a man pretending to be a woman? And, when you've met your obligations, could you come back to us? And what I got for that, like 2 hours later, I don't know why I said these things. Yeah, a little bit, a little bit of a head of steam I had on myself that day. But yeah. Thank you. I mean, I don't actually regret it. Like, I think you have to, I regret not being able to help women anymore, but I can help them in other ways, not through the ABA. And it did fundamentally compromise me to stay with the ABA once I realised what they'd done. So that got me another breach of code of conduct, serious email. It was actually, we've noticed this morning you've breached the code of conduct twice, take care, blocked. Nice, yeah. Okay, so, this isn't about me or about the other counsellors, although I'll be forever furious and angry with the ABA for the way that they've treated us all. But it does matter for a whole load of other reasons. So just to, remind us all why it matters. And I just wanted to thank one of our fellow sisters who created this cartoon for me. When I was in the depths of despair, it did cheer me up, And I love that on the witch burning, we've got the ABA logo as well. Because they did throw mothers and babies in the fire with this ideological war. So, as I said before, babies need their mother and her milk. And on both sides of this desexed, horrific ideology, it takes that away from babies. So whether you're separating babies from their mother to give it to their pseudo-mother, or whether you're removing the breasts of the actual mother to make her a man, the baby loses in both instances. And fundamentally, mothers and women, this is not to be too religious about it, but it is sacred work that we do. And, both birth and breastfeeding, we should be proud of that. And, we should be respected and honoured for that unique role that we have. So, just on the health front, it is a women's health organisation at the ABA, and breastfeeding really matters for mothers and their babies and our long-term health. So that's pretty hurtful that they even step an inch away from that in their focus. When resources are so slim and so many mothers and babies fall through the cracks, don't even know that the ABA exists or don't realise that it's there to support them. And then also, future detransitioners. I just can't imagine, that, I know what breastfeeding grief is, and I help women with that, for a long time. And those young women who've been told that, this is the way to a happy life, who are going to, detransition, many of them, a few years later, and are gonna hate themselves their whole lives, So, I'll never forgive the ABA for betraying those future detransitioners as they have. And also, like, chest feeding is formula feeding, like the whole point of a breastfeeding inclusive society is undermined by validating, a trans male identity for women, which will mean that those, if they have babies in the future, they'll be formula fed. Yeah, and child sexual abuse, can we just remember that, men are 97% of all sex offenders, and, pedophiles are almost exclusively men. And although there may be some, trans women who, I'm sure there are trans women who aren't, sexually aroused by babies, that they are sexually aroused, some of them, by the idea of themselves as women, and autogynephilia, like, this is not a new diagnosis. We know that this is a real thing, and just the complete refusal to risk assess that that's part of this community, I just, I can't forgive the ABA for that. And I have to say, I've raised it with them. I've sent, these same people that you see quoted every time, I've sent them copies of serious academic psychological journals talking about autogynephilia and, and also like sexual orientation around pedophilia, and they just say, oh, it's not relevant. That's not part of what we're doing. They just completely stick their heads in the sand. So, yeah. And then, also just the denial of like adoptive mothers, lesbian mothers, that they're all the same as men. So, in the booklet, that they've put out for rainbow families, one of the most offensive bits is where they say, we're more the same than we're different. And that, babies, boy and girl, have the same breast tissue before puberty. And that it's then the female hormones that develop the breast tissue, and then again through pregnancy, breast tissue develops. So therefore, we know that adoptive mothers can breastfeed. We know that women who've had breast surgery will be able to breastfeed to some extent, and therefore men can breastfeed. Like, that's the kind of logical jump, Yeah. And for women as well who have low supply or other issues for hormonal reasons, to lump them in the same category as men. That's what they've done. So, unfortunately, the ABA has lost its way, and although there will be women who can find support for themselves still within the ABA, and many women who are members or call the National Helpline will never know that this ideology has crept into the heart of the ABA. It has. So, I'm sorry to tell you, but hopefully one day we'll be able to get the ABA back.